Namaste, everyone. Welcome back to the Yoga and Mental Health Summit. I'm Ashley Turner, your host, and we are here today with David Emerson. David Emerson, thank you so much for joining us today.
You bet. Thanks for inviting me.
David's been at the top of my list also to interview for this summit. David is the director of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment at the Justice Resource Institute. He is the founder of the Trauma Center for Trauma Sensitive Yoga, TCTSY, and the co-founder of the Center for Trauma and Embodiment at the Justice Resource Institute in Massachusetts. David's trained internationally in the TCTSY model since 2006 and has developed, conducted, and supervised the TCTSY groups for rape crisis centers, domestic violence centers, residential programs for youth, active duty military personnel, survivors of terrorism, and veterans administration centers and clinics, and many, many more. He's the author and co-author of numerous papers on yoga and trauma. He is the co-author of Overcoming Trauma Through Yoga, released in 2011 by North Atlantic Books, and the author of Trauma Sensitive Yoga in Therapy. Such a pleasure. You are really a pioneer in the field of trauma resolution and yoga. And I'd love to hear how you got started in yoga and how that came to weave with trauma resolution.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for being interested. Let's see. So I guess I would say I actually started with this whole project from the perspective of like a social worker in training. So the first work I did after college was in residential programs with youth. So I had some, I'd say frontline social work experience for a few years, which kind of got me moving in this direction. At a certain point, I decided I would go back to school to become a clinical social worker, a therapist. And at that roughly the same time, I started my own Tai Chi and then yoga practice. So that all coincided. As I went back to graduate school, I learned that talk therapy wasn't quite the right fit for me, but I had really been developing my own personal practices of Tai Chi and then yoga. And I found a lot of benefit there. So I think the transition there was gradual, but pretty clear to me that it was a movement from a little bit away from the clinical perspective and more toward the embodiment kind of perspective, I guess, that I got from yoga mostly. And then from there, coming back to the social work world. So kind of like interweaving, like a little bit of social work and yoga, and then finding a way to bring them both together eventually.
That's been such a parallel theme for so many people. I was just interviewing Dr. Laura Tober out of Australia, and I know for myself, it's been very similar, that weaving back and forth and seeing how they fit together and just really getting your hands in the clay and molding it and letting it see what it wants to become.
Yeah, for sure. Right.
So let's just start with the definition of what is trauma. I did do a trauma-informed yoga summit, which we had your colleague Jen Turner on last year, but I'd love to hear from you, because so many people watching, and I think, trauma, thank goodness, trauma resolution, trauma-informed care is sort of really a buzzword right now, and it's come into the collective unconscious in the last couple of years, in the collective consciousness in the last couple of years. But for those people watching, just to give them a clear definition, how do you define trauma?
Yeah, and I think similar to yoga, there are multiple definitions, right? So it's a discussion that's great that you're having, and the kind of discussions we're having all the time too, but it might be useful to make some distinctions. For example, stress is language that a lot of yoga teachers and like therapists might be familiar with. So we're meeting a lot of folks that are dealing with stress or chronic stress. And these are phenomena that are identifiable, usually associated with the nervous system. So like an overactivation of the nervous system, in particular with chronic stress. PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is its own phenomenon. And that's a diagnosable, at least in the Western framework, condition that is related to both trauma, kind of trauma exposure, and in some ways, unfortunately, also has the language of stress in there. But in order to kind of like break PTSD down, it might be useful to think about the diagnosis as it shows up in the medical literature, and it relates to exposure to life-threatening experiences in particular, whereas stress doesn't necessarily have to involve life-threatening experiences. So PTSD is a diagnosable phenomenon that is also different from chronic or complex trauma, which is really what our yoga model is geared toward. And complex trauma, it has some particular characteristics, relational experiences, so that there are experiences that happen in the context of relationships and over time. So longitudinal qualities as well. And we can think about, kids that grow up in chronically abusive or neglectful environments, people that are trapped or stuck in relationships that are abusive or neglectful. Refugees are often trapped in scenarios like that. Prisoners of war, for example, things like that. So for us, it's important to make sure we're having these conversations and understanding that what we're presenting here is not for stress particularly, or even for post-traumatic stress disorder in and of itself. We're really focused more on the relational dynamics, the long-term chronic experiences of disempowerment in the context of relationships, and what that, the impacts that has on a person and a human organism. There's a lot of research that's available around trauma, but not a whole lot of treatments that have been particularly built for complex trauma. So, I think it's important for us as a community to keep that conversation going and do our best to understand what those different phenomena are.
Mm-hmm. So just to clarify to the difference between, and I know some of you watching, probably also watch the Trauma Informed Summit and are perhaps, trauma sensitive therapists or yoga teachers as well. But just to clarify for others, the difference between, maybe we could say like acute trauma and then the complex trauma. So complex trauma would be ongoing exposure to, as you said, maybe it's neglectful environments or a misattunement, attachment disorders, and then, or, any kind of, I guess, threatening environment, like for a, as you said, longitudinal relational experience. And then how would you define acute trauma?
Yeah. For listeners that aren't familiar with Judith Herman, I mean, if just to throw a recommendation out there to understand complex trauma, there's a book called Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman, which is really a centerpiece in terms of the development of this framework, this understanding around relational trauma. And it definitely undergirds what we do. And in terms of relational trauma and Judith Herman's perspective, it's about power dynamics. So surviving, chronic disempowerment is really the nature of complex trauma. And how would you characterize it? It's a holistic experience to survive chronic disempowerment. We really build our entire system around that kind of survival. And it has deep, neurophysiological impacts. As you mentioned, attachment and relational impacts, very, very deep. PTSD, really the only official medical diagnosis we have for trauma, really it requires a single incident, and it is characterized as life-threatening or observing someone else's sort of life or bodily integrity being threatened, which has a little bit of breadth to it. But once you have an experience like that and then a certain set of symptoms, you can get that particular diagnosis. So it really is linked to an event, a single event in particular. Chronic or complex or developmental trauma it's broad, it's long term, it's really interwoven into our life experience. And then, as a result, sort of our relationship to our body and to our experience in life is completely is integrated into the trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
I've never heard the term that you used, chronic. I think it was chronic disempowerment, or being in it. Was that what it was exactly?
Yeah.
And I love that because it really speaks to, you know, the hierarchical relational quality, whether it's in a family dynamic or in a system. I mean, we could, you know,
Yep.
of course, white supremacy and the culture we live in with dominant cultures, you know, overriding, and that chronic disempowerment and the inherited traumas too, that are generational as well and cultural.
Absolutely. I think that's right. You're building on the complex layers, and it may be, and we're borrowing from Judith Herman here with this language of empowerment and disempowerment, or just power dynamics. It is overlaid like that. So we know that racism, for example, and poverty are drivers. They're exacerbators as well of trauma. So, and it's all, you know, from that perspective, it's about power and surviving in those in conditions where it's a constant power struggle.
And so let's talk about what are some ways. And so you really developed the trauma sensitive yoga and this entire training. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the pillars, at least for those people watching, so they feel like they can get sort of some working tools or knowledge to at least start to inform their classes.
Yeah.
What are some of the biggest pillars that how we can modify as a collective, as teachers, to make our yoga more trauma sensitive?
Yeah, right. So if we start from that perspective of power in the relationship as it's showing up and evolving in the moment, we're making an effort as providers, as facilitators, to just be attuned to what's happening with power. And you know, one way to think about it could be, you know, am I making an effort to share power, or am I hoarding power? So it's like the trauma dynamic is about power hoarding from, you know, the perpetrator's perspective, and the survivor is trying to deal with that, those dynamics around sort of having power consistently drawn away, you know, withheld or drawn away in all kinds of different ways. So as a facilitator with TCTSY, we're making this effort to share power. And, you know, one concrete way to do that is to use invitational language. So every time you're, you know, offering cues in these yoga forms, and we could even talk about it today if you want, but
yeah, for
just
sure.
like how many cues, you know, show up or are available in even in one form, beginning to really attune to making that those invitations instead of commands or directions. And that alone, potentially, right, if we're committed to it and we're making an effort, can really shift like what's happening in the relationship. So I would say, you know, that's a place to start, you know,
The invitational language. And I mean, I know, and I said this in many of the interviews in the Trauma Informed Yoga Summit, certainly when I was coming up as a teacher 20 years ago, there was absolutely no conversation around this, no awareness around this. And in fact, the yoga tradition, especially in the guru lineage, has been that power over is sort of the default of the teacher coming in and commanding and ordering and explaining and, you know, guiding in one particular way. And that's a very different, you know, dynamic. And for me, it's been a real relearning, and still I catch myself, you know, coming in with sort of directive language instead of invitational language. So
totally, I know it's true. And I remember in my experience as, you know, learning how to be a yoga teacher, we were told to use directional language, right? Not use ing words, because people need that clarity.
yeah.
And like you were talking about the yoga, sort of some traditions and so forth. And I think that's also really interesting for us to, as a community, to really be thinking about. And
Yeah.
did we, if we've inherited a more command-oriented approach, where did that come from? Is it inherent in the yoga system, or
Right.
is it something that we've kind of more, for whatever reasons, we've sort of overlaid here in like in a Western way? But I think, I think it's a great conversation for us all to have about why is it that we feel like we need to be in control of what's happening, and why does 200 hours of yoga training, like make me an expert in everybody else's body experience? Is that really true? And if it's not true, and if we know that deep down, right, as a facilitator, then we're probably going to grasp onto the control even a little bit more, and just continue to just wrangle with people, around power. And so, so can we let go a little bit, about around who's in charge of what's happening, and still have a role, right? Because I think it can be threatening for for us as yoga teachers. Like, well, what's my role then if I'm not telling people what to do in the forms, and then that opens up possibilities for us with yoga and trauma in particular. And in fact, so another thing maybe to offer is, if our job is not to tell people what to do, it gives us a little bit more room to sort of co-participate, to have an experience together as it's evolving in the moment. So in this model, we use this language around shared authentic experience to give the facilitator like something to do, which is taking responsibility for yourself and what's happening in your body, the choices you're making, as you're offering this opportunity to whoever else is there too.
And I think it's a really interesting conversation around what is the role of teacher and student, and not to, pivot completely down this rabbit hole, but I do find that it's so baked into our, let's say, Western culture, this inherent power dynamic in almost every structure in our whole educational system, certainly not just the yoga tradition.
Yep.
But in our medical system, in our educational system, and all these different structures that we have, that I find, people are coming to class, students are coming, for example, to my teacher training and wanting that, like, just to be handed a manual and be handed a checklist, and here's, A, B, C, and D. And once I master these things, because that's the model of education that we've been sold, then you're validated, then you check that box, got that certificate, now you know your stuff. And really, I think for me, the role is to continue that deep didactic, Socratic method of like inquiry of what is your truth, what's coming up for you, what would you do in this situation? And so continuing to help reinstall that onus of authority and power back into the student, because so many of us are so used to, not just in a trauma-informed class, but any class in any kind of teaching, environment, look to someone else for the answers. And I think that's one way that the yoga practice can have such a corrective experience psychologically of reinstalling that empowerment within the individual.
Yeah, totally. And the beauty of, right, like a asana or based practice is that we get these little opportunities, these forms where we can actually interact with that stuff. So it's like, it doesn't even have to be theoretical. It's like, what do you want to do with this form? Like, here's a real time thing we can try. I can be responsible for myself, make choices for myself, and provide that opportunity for somebody else if they're interested. And we get to see what happens.
So let's pivot a little bit and talk about some of the research because I know that, a lot of the work that you and Jen and your colleagues are doing, the Justice Resource Institute, and with, trauma sensitive yoga, one thing that you are doing is gathering a lot of research and what is working? Like, what does show to be effective in trauma resolution, and particularly in the embodied practices? And maybe we should just start by talking about what does it even mean to be embodied, and what's an embodied practice, and why is that so important in trauma resolution?
Yeah. Well, a lot of interesting stuff there. I mean, yeah, the embodiment thing, you know, there are various definitions around what does that mean. From this perspective, we're working with a Western model called interoceptive theory. So interoception is like our capacity, our experience, our felt experience of our self, our internal self. So muscles contracting and extending, for example, you know, just the sensory experience of being embodied. And that's a way to understand what embodiment is. And we're adopting that because there are indications with complex trauma that our interoceptive process can be dysregulated. You know, the research suggests that surviving chronic disempowerment, if you like, or that struggle has an impact on our experiences of our embodied self. So interoceptive parts of the brain seem to be dysregulated. So the question, like, we wonder if we can use these yoga forms to practice being embodied, practice our interoceptive capacity. So yeah, that's sort of the perspective we're taking on embodiment. It's like a felt sense of being.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, the yoga, yeah.
Would you say that, I just want to ask you one question before you go on, the interoception, so the interior felt sense of oneself, what part of the brain does that comes online when we're experiencing interoception?
Yeah, there are several different parts of the brain, it seems, but one is, I'm not a neuroscientist, so for me, it really helps to stay focused on one part of the brain. It's called the insular cortex, and it's right in the middle of the brain. And it seems to be that everything we feel in our body, even if we're not conscious of it, hits this part of the brain, the insula, right in the middle. So, and it's, in fact, where the insula is located, there's no language. So, you know, some of the things we feel in our bodies will then become conscious or frontal lobe experiences, but not all of them. They all seem to hit the insula. And so the research, like around trauma and interoception, indicates some dysregulation here in the insular cortex.
And that's an interesting to note that there's no language there, that sometimes, I think that's, for me, just anecdotally, personally, I can say that one of the ways I began to really feel such a sense of empowerment and growing sense of self or confidence was that interoception. I mean, I never had that term and would never have even known what that was 15, 20 years ago, but as a student, and the fact that we may not always have language to describe what we're feeling or the sensation, and that's actually part of the empowerment, is waking up that language of sensation itself, not necessarily a verbal cognitive languaging, but an interior experience and the communication that's happening on the somatic level.
Totally. And yeah, I think that's the way you describe that is so great, because if we can take that perspective and explore it a little bit, we can't really explain it, and nobody from the outside can really direct you. You know, there's no expert from the outside, no language that comes at you from the outside that can direct you along those lines. So using directional language is pretty futile anyway. So if we can just let that go and sort of attune more to like that language that's more inside, in a sense, right? That we can experience, but we might not have words for.
And it sort of dovetails with that. No one outside of us can tell us what we're feeling, because they don't, you know, there's no way they can know, much less we might not even be able to verbally communicate it. So it's really a deep ownership of interior experience and self that no one can touch. And this is like, the more that we anchor into that sense of self, and then, you know, let our actions, our, you know, thoughts arise from that interior space, it's really sort of solidifying that within
Yeah,
us.
totally. Yeah, that's it. I mean, yep.
Okay, so trauma. So number one in trauma resolution of really creating that interoception, strengthening that interoception. And then you were saying a little bit, I sort of changed gears a little bit, but what the research is showing, and that interoception is very important in trauma resolution. And anything else?
Yeah, no, I think that's you know, a large part of what theoretically working with is the experiences of not having a relationship that you can rely on with your body. So a lot of the outcomes of complex trauma they're body based, self-harm, self-medication,
Mm.
relational dynamics that might be dangerous in different ways. It's ways of dealing with our body that might be related to not getting this reliable information from our bodies, or predictable information from our bodies. So yeah, we're using yoga to try to sort of exercise that capacity.
Mm-hmm.
And then something you said also made me think about another piece, which is getting that information and then deciding what to do next.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in trauma theory, there's a lot about agency and, you know, not having control or choice potentially about what's happening. So we're using yoga forms to practice making choices as well, deciding what we want to do. And, you know, one way to do that is to notice what you feel,
Mm-hmm.
and then make a choice about what's going to happen next.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. I've also never heard it described in such a clear way that so many of the symptoms or so many of the effects or byproducts of experiencing complex or developmental trauma end up being body-based. So whether it's addiction or self-harm, why do you think that is, that there's a relationship? And I know it's kind of working theoretically, or maybe not, but the relationship between, because I'm so obsessed really and fascinated with the relationship of psyche and soma, but when one is experiencing a consistent disempowered experience, whether that's in a childhood home, or, you know, in another environment, or just a collective, why would it end up that it so often is a body-based experience on the other side, or maybe imbalance on the other side? Is that something in relationship to control, or our sense of self, or having agency over that? What, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it is complicated, and it is theoretical. There really are no answers. There's some qualitative evidence, you know, what people talk about, like the experiences of living in conditions like that of chronic disempowerment, and what is it like to survive. So one way that I think about it that helps me, I think, is the priority there is survival. And we have a lot of tools at our disposal as a human being to survive.
Mm-hmm.
It's something that I also like to put out there is anyone who's approaching, you know, let's say a yoga teacher or a therapist looking for trauma care has survived, and there's a tremendous amount of power there. The trade-offs can be complicated. So letting go of your body is a way to survive. And in the, you know, in the trauma language, there's it's called dissociation. It's a way to just separate, as you were saying, kind of your mind and your body, you know, in a simplistic way, to move away from what's happening in your body. So the sort of trauma we're talking about is always embodied, whether it's chronic manipulation or abuse, or chronic withdrawal, withholding, neglect. It's all about what's happening with your body and the people that are, you know, involved in your life, and whether they're caretakers or not. So, yeah, I think survival is very much a body embodied experience, and the ability to separate from your body is a really important skill in terms of survival. It just makes living difficult. If we're trying to move through, like live a life where we can't rely on our body to ground us, in the present moment, so from which we can have experiences, relationships, keep a job, and it's really tough. It's difficult. So what we try to do here is honor the survival skills, including disembodiment, and practice embodiment in a way that's directed by the participant. It feels it's safe from their perspective, directed by the participant, and just kind of move from there. Because being disembodied is really hard. I've one thing I've picked up, and this is anecdotal and qualitative, but not feeling your body is worse than pain. It's worse than discomfort and pain. So, if we're kind of left with a body that we can't get information from at the end of the day, at the end of all this, practices of survival, that's a really tough place to be. So we're trying to come back into our body in some way or another.
And it seems like along with the interoception, it's also, sort of from, if we were looking through the lens of the chakras, the first chakra being our physical identity and our relationship to physical body, and also our relationship to safety, security, stability, any kind of embodiment practices, but certainly yoga in the asana sense is helping us to reestablish a sense of safety, or as you said, create that experience of embodiment, but not just the interoception of becoming more nuanced and alert to what's happening and more subtle awareness of what's happening interiorly, but also to begin to reroute into a sense of safety or control within our physical body, and maybe reestablish that sense of okayness, stability in embodiment.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, I don't know much about, that's one of my limitations. So that's really interesting to hear you say that. That sounds good.
Yeah, the chakras, I think it's really interesting because I have sort of always studied a lot, much more about the chakras, and not, for me, the trauma resolution is really my, leading edge right now of one of my limitations, and one of the reasons I'm trying to interview and really understand this very important field. But I found it really interesting in studying the chakras how, first chakra, Muladhara, as the physical identity. And when you look at what addictions are associated with different chakras, typically the addictions associated with first chakra wounding is definitely eating disorders. So that's everything having to do with control in the body and a sense of disembodiment or minimizing of the body, or dissociation, if you will. I think self-harm as well, anything having to do with food. So those are just a few, but it's interesting to me, that correlation, if you just look more metaphorically at the whole system and what's happening when someone is in a chronic disempowered environment with complex trauma. And so much of that, like you said, has to do with just survival. So we're really working with that survival instinct and trying to create a corrective experience in a trauma-informed embodiment practice. Yeah.
Yeah, or even, even just offer other opportunities potentially aside from survival. Like, for me, another thing that helps me is participants that I get to work with know how to survive. They're masters at survival. And it's sort of like offering other possibilities aside from survival, because if life is only survival, it gets to be a real drain. And so is it possible for there to be other things besides survival? And so we're kind of experimenting with that a little bit too.
I love that. Let's talk a little bit about how your training has changed over the years and how has the program evolved over time, things that you've seen more needed or more effective.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there have been a lot of changes, but maybe just to offer a few highlights. For us, we in our first two pilot studies, we did physical assists, thinking that our thinking at the time was that we would be very clear and make sure we always got permission, and we wanted to create a space where folks felt that touch could be safe. And we sort of worked with that for a few years, as a matter of fact, and finally we started to really get feedback, or I think it's probably more that we were open to hearing feedback. It took us time, and it really turned out that physical touch in our framework was really counterproductive. And the reasoning for that, what we learned from interviews with folks, some of the studies, the qualitative studies where we got feedback, was we were inviting people to pay attention to their internal body experience and make choices from there. And when we would intervene physically, it sort of short-circuited that possibility. People would say things like, you tell me that I'm in charge of myself, but every time you put your hands on me, I feel like I have to do it your way. So it was like we were sending a message with the physical touch that was overriding everything else. So we learned how powerful touch is, and how in our model how negative it was. So we finally let that go. By the time we got our grant in 2009, which was the first grant given by NIH to study yoga for trauma, we had let go of all that physical touch, and the study was like far more successful. I think the main data point there was in the previous two, half the people dropped out. And in the large NIH study, no one dropped out. So one person left because I think she was moving a lot for her job, but she didn't want to leave per se. So that's a huge change. And I think the physical touch was a big part of that.
Wow, that's so fascinating.
Yeah. It was a big learning. And I think something that we as a yoga community are ready to talk about more, like what is it around touch, and why is that involved? Why is that part of most yoga classes? Where does it come from? What's the purpose? What's the outcome?
Would you say that you would advocate to not do physical assists in most yoga classes? Is that?
Yeah, to be honest, so I would say personally at this point, everything I've learned, I personally don't think it's possible to create a culture of consent in a yoga studio or in a health club yoga class. I don't think the conditions are there for participants or students to really be able to make a consensual choice.
Without feeling some sort of pressure or default culture or something that, they have to.
There's too many, there's so many like social pressures and just unconscious dynamics at play in that moment. You're vulnerable in the position of a yoga student, and to have a person with power, ask, let alone not ask, which happens a lot in yoga classes, but ask if they can touch you. It's the conditions just aren't there to be able to make a choice that's consensual. So I think we should at least talk about it as a community more.
Yeah. And I also, it was kind of insightful for me to hear you say that people were saying, even though all of the verbal cues could be on point and, really spacious and empowering the students, if you then come up and offer an assist, to the chances of that being interpreted as a modification or a need to change or a desire to change it in some way just overrides everything. That's really fascinating.
Totally. I mean, I think it speaks to what we were talking about earlier, which is what's happening with our bodies is more powerful than what's happening with language.
Right. Or what a teacher could visually see, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so fascinating. And again, I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you're doing, because the scientific research is so important. I've interviewed Sapir Singh Khalsa on this summit, and we got into a really in-depth conversation about the need for scientific research in yoga so that we can get programs funded and we can get yoga integrated into schools, elementary schools, public schools, into the medical system. And the only way to do that is through scientific studies and research that backs it up so that people will say yes.
Yeah, it's
So,
one piece. Yeah, it's one piece of the pie for sure.
yeah, and you guys are doing such great work on that. So anything else that you guys have shifted over the years or found that really needed to evolve through the training?
Let's see. Yeah, I would say that understanding how important it is to, again, I use that language, the shared authentic experience. So for the facilitator to be able to participate in what's happening in a way that is, there's still boundaries, there's still a role for the facilitator for sure, and the participant, but for the person that's facilitating to be able to have room to engage in the process authentically. So as it's unfolding, to be able to notice what you're feeling, to make choices for yourself, has just become more, I feel like we've understood that more over time through feedback. I think it's more important than being in charge of what's happening in the room. There are definitely times where the facilitator needs to kind of step in. I would say, when you're working with trauma, there are moments, there are times where you need to step in for reasons of safety, and that can vary depending on the scenario. But most of the time in the practice, it's about taking responsibility for yourself. And that really shifts as well, shifting the dynamic. With trauma, the person with power is not taking responsibility for themselves. Their focus is more external, and so if you can turn that awareness or that attention more inward, it's takes practice, right? It's not about disconnecting from what's happening or shutting down from the experience of being with other people, but it's like using your energy to make choices for yourself and take responsibility for yourself really shifts what happens in the environment. So that's another big change over the years, I think.
That is fascinating, because it's interesting in my yoga psyche soul training, one of the things, and this comes from my psychotherapeutic training, of using the psychodynamics in the therapy room, clinical setting, where the therapist, and I really was never trained this way as a yoga teacher, but so much of the training is that way for a therapist, that you're using your instrument as that blank canvas and looking for that counter transference, whether it's a physical sensation or an emotion that might be rising, or even a thought that you might be thinking. And you are in that inner inquiry as a clinician, and then learning how to use that therapeutically, beneficially for who's in front of you, knowing that there's a shared collective unconscious, and what might be coming up for your client is most likely affecting you in some way. And so how can you begin to name that or bring awareness to that in a way that's beneficial? And from that, I've kind of translated that over for yoga teachers to begin to cultivate what I call 2 tracks of awareness. So you're aware of what's going on in the room and what you can see, and monitoring that and helping to guide and facilitate that. But you're also having that interior track of tracking what's happening for you physically, emotionally, taking responsibility for that.
Yeah.
Do you see that as a parallel, or?
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I would offer from this perspective is, and I think I understand what you mean, like around, transference and countertransference and the Western psychodynamic perspective. Yeah. The experiment that I find really interesting here is to not be gathering that information for the purpose of changing anything that's happening
Right.
or interacting in any way other than just having the experiences as they unfold.
Mm-hmm.
So that is, it's an experiment, I would offer. I would say it doesn't mean that countertransference isn't real.
Yeah.
It's just that with trauma, especially if we're using information to try to change things, it can
Sure.
become manipulative in a way that
Yeah.
people will pick up on. And as soon as manipulation or coercion is happening in any way, this is just something to offer, it'll become survival again.
Mm-hmm.
And people will know there are studies that show, like, kids who experience early life trauma, they recognize anger on people's faces far earlier than people who don't have those kinds of experiences. So we can become, so attuned to shifts, to changes, to coercion, to manipulation that, we'll just kick into survival. So if I can just pay attention to my experience for the sake of paying attention to my experience and not to do anything with it, it seems to shift what happens in a way that creates safety for the other person, potentially, to just have their experience for the sake of having their experience.
Yeah.
And then we get to do the interoceptive, practice and the agency thing. But I find it enjoyable. I think it's fun. It's fun to not have to do anything to not have to be thinking like, what's happening and what am I going to do with this information next? Just like, what's actually happening? What do I want to do next with my body experience? That kind of thing. So
no, that's a really important distinction, and I'm glad that you made that, because I think it kind of goes back to that. What is the role of the facilitator in really opening up a space, as you said, of shared authentic experience, that it's not one person trying to seek any kind of goal or outcome or aim or manipulate the situation or the environment or the student or the person, just to be in that. It's that egalitarian, right? It sort of democratizes the whole experience, so there's not that power dynamic.
That's the experiment, and it's the priority with complex trauma, which might not be the case with chronic stress or even PTSD, which is why, it's useful to really focus on some of those distinctions. If it's chronic stress, we might want techniques. We know about, like, breathing, for example, like learning how to breathe diaphragmatically can have an impact on the nervous system. With PTSD, there are symptoms, that you're sort of managing. So coming at that from a more symptomatic approach might make sense. But with complex trauma, it's so deep and subtle. It's about power and the relationship as it's actually happening.
Right.
So we're experimenting with really kind of shifting really the dynamics at the root of the relationship.
I've learned so much. This is so fascinating. I could just keep going into this rabbit hole with you. But I'd love to have you offer a practice, if you're open to that, a few minutes to just leave everyone with a bit of a takeaway. For
sure. Yeah, absolutely. So if you like, I'm sitting in a chair, so I'll facilitate from there. But for anybody who's listening, you might be standing, you might be sitting on the floor. If you want, feel free to give yourself a moment to just get oriented, whether you're sitting or standing, finding a way of situating your body that you prefer. And whenever you're ready, once you're kind of situated and oriented, maybe just starting with some movements. And one way to move could be shifting from side to side or forward and back. So it's just shifting around, whether you're sitting or standing. Another way to move could be more circular, more of a circular movement. So if you're moving around, you might feel your body making contact with the surface beneath you. Your body connected to the surface beneath you. So that's pressure or just contact points. Another thing you might feel is more sensation in your body. So these are muscle dynamics. If you're shifting around, your muscle dynamics are changing. Some muscles are lengthening, some are contracting, getting shorter. So you might feel some feeling in your body. And then whenever you're ready, maybe guiding yourself back toward the middle. You're welcome to stay with that longer than me if you want, but just coming back to the middle when you're ready. And a couple of possibilities. One could be a neck roll. And one way to do that could be dropping your chin and then rolling from side to side. Maybe dropping your chin through the middle and rolling from side to side. So it's like the bottom half of a circle here. You have a choice with this one. It could be like the bottom half of a circle, or you could lift your chin on either side, make it more like a, kind of like a U shape. In either case, you might start to feel some feeling or sensation around your neck if you're doing this. So maybe feeling some sensation around your neck if you're moving like this. And whenever you're ready, maybe guiding yourself back to neutral, back toward the middle. And one other thing, if you want to try another kind of movement, could be some shoulder circles. And if you like, you could roll your shoulders, and you might notice you could go forwards or backwards here. So that gives like a choice, an inherent choice, whether you move your shoulders backwards or forwards, your choice. Maybe beginning to feel some sensation around your shoulders if you're moving. In fact, so that's one possibility. One other way you could move your shoulders could be bringing your fingertips to the top of your shoulders and then making the circles with your elbows. It's just another possibility. So you could choose shoulder circles or more like elbow circles if you want. And then again, if you're moving your shoulders in some way, you might notice some feeling or sensation. Could be around your shoulders, maybe somewhere else in your body. And then you can come back to neutral whenever you're ready. If you feel like, I'll just throw another one out there. If you want to cut this one, feel free. But here's one other thing you could do if you want a way to move your spine. And basically this movement has two parts. So one part is kind of rounding and tucking your chin, rounding forward. The other part is lifting your chin, lengthening the front of your body. So maybe tucking and rounding. And then maybe lifting and lengthening. And then if you want, you can connect those two into a movement. So it could be that you're connecting these two parts into a movement. Or you may choose to do one at a time and take a few breaths. If you're moving here, you're in charge of the pace for yourself. You can You're welcome to move at your own pace. And we all might move at a different pace. Maybe trying a couple of those if you want. And then whenever you're ready, at your own time, maybe coming back to neutral, back to the center. There's just a couple of forms there to experiment with.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate that little example of the Trauma Center, Trauma Sensitive Yoga, TCTSY. And thank you so much for your breadth and depth of knowledge and sharing it with us today. And again, all of your devotion and great work that you and your whole team over at the Trauma Center are doing. It's really groundbreaking. It's so needed. And thank you for really furthering this conversation and sharing it with us today.
Thanks, Ashley. Thanks for engaging in the conversation. Appreciate it.
Yeah, so everyone, please check out all of David's links right below. The website for all of their current TCTSY trainings and the books and journals that are listed. Follow them. Take a screenshot today of this interview. Tag us on Instagram or Facebook. We want to get to know you. DM Dave or the TCTSY team, myself, and send us any questions that you might have. So we're here for you. Super exciting to build this yoga for mental health movement. And thank you all so much, particularly David and your whole team over there. I know you guys have such a great team. So thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, everybody. Take care.